So our final talk of today, we have Dr. Lesley Ann Noel with us. Lesley Ann is an educator and researcher with an interesting and varied background across multiple countries, and she describes herself as someone who is not afraid of adventure. Her work focuses on emancipatory research that is centered around the perspectives of those who would traditionally be excluded from research or design-based learning or design thinking. Her talk today explores what it would look like to help people imagine far, far out into the future as a step toward co-creating a more equitable present. So Dr. Lesley Ann will give part of her talk, and then we'll have some questions at the have some minutes at the end for a Q&A. So feel free to put in your questions at the chat in the chat as we go along in the Q&A tab. And I welcome Dr. Lesley Ann Noel.
Thank you so much, Marina. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Just a second. So it was really exciting to see those prizes and awards being given just before I started. And good evening to people in Europe. Good afternoon from my part of the world. I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina. And this talk is called Co-Creating Equitable Futures. I may vary a little bit from what Marina described, but generally I'm going to be on track. So Toni Morrison gave us this really wonderful quote. All utopias are described by people who are not allowed in. And I see this as a design quote. People who are left out and imagine and create the worlds that we need. They shine a light on what is not good enough and either nudge us or push us to create change. As designers, people have a visionary, people who have a visionary and world building capability. It's important for us to figure out how do we make sure to listen to the voices of people who might be left out of decision-making conversations. And in design justice, Sasha Costanza-Chuck also reminds us that transformation happens at the margins and that people who are left out, people who are at the margins, people who are not quite well served are the people who make change or show us where change is needed. So the name of my talk, it reveals the key themes in my work at this time: co-creation, equity, and futures. And I've been trying to operate at all times at the intersection of these three, particularly for the last 3 years. I'm going to divide up the conversation to focus on each section. So we will talk about co-creation, equity, and future strategies and see how we combine these in our work as designers to create sustainable social change. Before we start, I'll share a little bit about my own positionality. I've been in design since middle school, believe it or not, in Trinidad and Tobago, where I'm from. And in my practice, I'm interested in bringing a decolonial lens to the work that I do and different perspectives as a Black woman from the Caribbean. I'm currently in Raleigh, North Carolina, in the United States. I've been focusing on equity, social justice, and the experiences of people who are often excluded from design research, and integrating emancipatory, critical, and anti-hegemonic perspectives into the design process. I'm originally an industrial designer, but I wade in the waters on the edge of service design. 20 years ago, I was interested in materials and processes, but today I'm much more interested in people and social justice. And I sometimes feel like I can call myself an activist. I want to create a more just and better world. And my main activity is design education. But since I'm in academia, I can sometimes ask questions that the practitioner might not be able to ask. So first, let's have a conversation about co-creation. I'm using the word co-creation, but there are different words to describe what I'm talking about, with some variations in the meaning with each definition. So words like co-design, participatory design, and even emancipatory design could be almost synonyms. The aim of co-creation is to create greater participation and to bring the beneficiaries of the design into the action of solving their own problems. So if you're in civic innovation as well, co-creation can also move people up the ladder of citizen participation. This is a concept that was created by Sherry Arnstein, and it describes how people move from being passive to active citizens. In some co-design examples, collaborators lead the process, while in others they participate and enrich the process. But the aim is to innovate around the needs of people who are impacted by the area of focus. Co-design is an approach to designing with and not designing for people. It's about elevating voices and knowledge of people with lived experience and combining this with that of people with learned experience, everyone working together to improve something that everyone cares about. If you have heard of Paulo Freire and critical pedagogy, then co-design is like using a critical pedagogy approach to your design process. In critical pedagogy, the teacher isn't the person with the knowledge. Everyone has knowledge, and we all bring this knowledge together to mix it and to learn together. So the teachers are learning and the students are learning from each other. And co-design is a bit like that process, where it's not only the designer with the expertise. And so we respect in this co-design process many different types of expertise within the group of people who we're working with. And we know that everyone can learn from each other. Co-design is as much about the process as the outcome. So that's something to keep in mind. The results are important, but not more important than the process. And these processes move on their own, at their own pace. So you might plan the process, but the outcome will be difficult to predict and may not look like anything you would have expected. And some of the principles, which I'm seeing from the results of the competition, some of you already know this. Some of the key principles are sharing power, prioritizing and building relationships using participatory means and building capability. And this also requires significant investment in building trust. It's a slow design process, and speed is something that many of us have to unlearn. How are we going to slow down to honor the relationship building process? Co-design draws on empathetic relationship building skills, and sometimes we need food, drink, music, dance, and storytelling to create the right environment for collaboration. So everyone designs. It's a human ability. You have to learn to recognize that capacity exists before you start the co-design process, and have to become a little bit more humble and see, well, okay, people already have this design ability, and this can actually put you into some kind of existential crisis, because you think, okay, so what am I doing if the people are already designing? So in this process, actually, our roles as designers change as people who work in co-design. And traditionally, as designers, we may have been taught to be kind of experts. Many of us may have wanted to be like Philippe Starck, rock star kind of designers that we would have heard about in the 80s and the 90s. In service design, maybe you had different aspirations, but certainly in industrial design and graphic design, many of us wanted to be people who would have been recognized because of the chairs that we designed or the posters and fonts that we had created. But now we are operating in a different way. Where today many designers focus much more on social good and making change, and they're trying to figure out how we're going to create more participatory processes that are compatible with activism, social justice, and collective good. In our new roles as co-designers, we are facilitators, and sometimes we amplify people's work rather than doing things for people. Sometimes we are activists, we are organizers, we are logistics planners, listeners, maybe even counselors, and we must ensure that there is space for other people to participate, sometimes doing what they themselves might not have considered doing. And what about the skills? Many of these roles that we end up taking on require different skills. You learn to look, you learn to listen, to respect, to negotiate power with people, to share power, support people, because in this kind of community engaged design practice, you're not just a designer, you often end up holding many other roles. So co-design is about shifting power and democratizing the design process through collaboration and participation. And so here are some strategies that some of you probably already know, but these could help create more participatory environments for design. So number one, get people to tell you who they are and what they're good at and what they like doing. Remind them that they're the biggest resource that you have in the design activity and that you are just a facilitator, and let them relate to one another and share information. Let participants collaboratively generate magnificent knowledge, rich knowledge, and fresh new outcomes as they bring in their own personal experiences and knowledge of the issue in focus. So you may have your outcomes in mind, but let the participants take some control. Here's another strategy. Bring a sacrificial idea to the process. Some people do not think generatively, but they can critique and edit something that already exists. So if you're willing to sacrifice your idea, it can be a great starting point that where you allow other people to just tear your idea apart and put it back together again. Because, you know, sometimes I'll do that in a design process. You have to kind of toughen up your shoulders, but you bring this idea that will be sacrificed because it will just make the design process easier for some people, okay? And they give you all of this advice as to how to put it back together, and it no longer looks like the thing that you brought to the sacrifice. And then another strategy, ensure that you've created space where people will feel comfortable enough to give you real feedback, you know, where people will actually help you put the thing back together after you've torn it apart. So that they can participate richly in the process. Here's another strategy. Create many different modes of participation. These can be verbal, visual, written, drawing, corporal, etc. I once facilitated a workshop where we all danced as part of the workshop and as part of the expression. And there are workshops where people draw instead of writing, you know, make sure that there are many different ways of participating. And then a final strategy, consider collaborative methods at every stage of the design process. So from the empathy building phase to understand the issue, to the brainstorming, defining, prototyping, testing, all of these can be done collectively. And also consider co-design for different aims that go beyond just design outcomes, such as making something together to build relationships and creating shared experiences. So one question, if we were all in the same Zoom room, I would ask people to put this in the chat. How are you doing co-design with real people in your design practice? But I'm going to go straight into the next part of the conversation. So let's talk a little bit about equity. So equity is a term that needs some disambiguation. That's a word that we find on Wikipedia sometimes. So equity can be a few things. It can be the quality of being fair and impartial. It can be a branch of the law that developed alongside common law in order to remedy some of its defects in fairness and justice. It can be the value of shares issued by a company, and it can be stocks and shares that carry no fixed interest. The element of equity that I like to focus on is about understanding and giving people what they need to enjoy full and healthy lives. So in diversity, equity, and inclusion circles, a distinction is made between equity and equality. Equity is a contextual concept, which is different from equality, which is proffered as neutral. And that everyone should have the same things and the same opportunities, all right? And that's fair. That's how people look at equality, saying that people should get the same things and that's fair. But actually it's not fair. It is difficult to see that it's not fair because in somewhere like the United States where I live right now, the myth of opportunity can get into the way of seeing unfairness. But we can think of the historical, the social, the geographical, and the cultural, all the differences that people start off with in society. And we can trace historically how people have been disadvantaged, discriminated against, and historically marginalized. And then when we analyze all of that, it actually shouldn't be hard for people to understand why we need to fight for equity rather than equality. But most of us actually are trained to think about equality, where we are taught throughout our lives to treat people the same. And sometimes then people get upset or uncomfortable with the concept of people treating people differently because of the way we've been trained throughout our lives. But the reality is that we sometimes don't see the systems that oppress people, that exclude them. We forget that the starting point of the success story may actually have been several generations ago and not today. And then we don't recognize sometimes that different people need different inputs to achieve the same outputs. So equity is a concept which points to fairness, and it takes into consideration the obstacles, the historical, political, economic, and cultural obstacles that exist in society. And both equality and equity point to fairness, but one concept sees us as all the same, and it's value neutral, and the other concept recognizes the difference and recognizes that the unique lived experiences of each individual in history and the politics and economics behind who we are and where we're at. So simply put, equality aims to ensure that everyone gets the same things in order to enjoy full and healthy lives, while equity ensures that everyone gets what they need to enjoy full and healthy lives. And in our work as designers with an interest in equity, our focus therefore would be ensuring equitable outcomes, because equity is about outcomes while equality is about inputs. And so we can focus on equitable outcomes to drive some of our design questions. So this brings us to this well-known cartoon. A lot of people might have seen this. It's circulated pretty widely in social media. And equity is actually about giving people different boxes so that everyone can get the same view of the game that's in progress. And as equity-centered designers, we can be working harder to make sure that people get the same view. My colleague in England, who is 61, she recently gave me an interesting equity issue related to pension, where she pointed out to me that, in England, everyone has the same pension age, which is 66, and this is based on the principle of equality. But my friend, who has been working class all of her life, pointed out that equity in pension ages would actually recognize that working class people, manual laborers, many people of color, people who have been in prison, for example, they die at a younger age, and maybe they die in their 50s. And so many of them will never make it to post-pension life. So a design question around this could be, how do we ensure all groups enjoy similar support in their post-work lives, or that they enjoy similar types of benefits later on in life? But if we go back to the fence and the baseball game, what if we just got rid of the fence? Could abolition be a design principle? And abolition is a word that I'm starting to bring into all of my design conversations and asking people, what are the systems that just need to be abolished? What are the, what are the systems that are keeping people back? Sometimes in our design work, we propose tiny incremental changes, maybe because we think only incremental changes will be accepted. We think that people aren't ready for anything that's more radical. But sometimes we have to completely reframe the way that we ask these questions as well. And we have to ask, what do we need to completely get rid of? What needs to be abolished? What structures need to be burnt down? And what is the radical change that is needed to make sure that we actually get to the fairness, to the concept of fairness for everyone. I've spoken quite a bit about equity with colleagues who are lawyers. And so I got many of these anecdotes from lawyers, actually. And one South African lawyer shared with me recently that their post-apartheid constitution was created through a co-design process with a lot of community-based participation, where they had to rethink their concept of equality around the history of apartheid. And so the Constitution is grounded in substantive equality, which is equivalent to what we call in the equity in the United States. And this is that you treat people the same within certain categories, and you make specific provisions for fair discrimination for the benefit of the groups that need the additional support. So these are some terms that I am encouraging you as designers to think about and embrace in your own practice: equity, participation, liberation, emancipation, abolition. You know, these are new design principles, or these could be new design principles for us. And then one design question that I'd like you to consider as you move forward and reflect on your work is: how might we dismantle the systems that create blockages and obstacles for a fair society? And then another design question to consider as you move forward in your work: how might we include equity, emancipation, liberation, and abolition in our design or design thinking process? So now I'm going to move you into the third part of the conversation, which is about the future. So all design is speculative, and we are going to talk about how, as designers, we use this in our work. And one question that we all have to ask then as designers often is: what is in fact the future that we want, right? So as I just said, all design is speculative. You know, once we're designing something, we're thinking about future use and future contexts, and everything that we design is about the future because we're imagining the use in the future. And according to Herbert Simon, to design is to devise courses of actions aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones in the future, actually. And there is actually, though, an area of design, or there are a few areas of design which are more tied to future and future outlooks and points of views. And one is speculative design. So speculative design goes a little bit further, and where people move beyond the way that we would normally design for something in the future. And Dunn and Raby, who are the authors of Speculative Everything, which is a book that a lot of designers refer to, they say that typical design looks at small issues, while speculative design, which is a really specific area in design research, broadens the scope to tackle the biggest issues in society, like wicked problems, and where the results then of speculative design are not just tied to creating objects that are functional or useful. They're trying to create objects that force us to think about problems differently. And the outcomes or outputs of speculative design might not be useful objects per se. They are things to make us reflect and think. And so then the use of the future, further out future in design, tends to be then to push us to explore new concepts, think much more broadly than we do in our day-to-day as designers. So in Futures and Foresighting work, we talk about this cone of future possibilities by Voros, building on the work of Mintzberg, Horton, and Slaughter. And many of us design for probable or projected futures. And that's interesting as an, or it can be interesting as an exercise to push people even further, you know, to sometimes push people to preposterous or impossible futures, to get people to expand the way that they think about a problem or an issue. So probable futures may take account of current trends that we know are likely to happen. Plausible futures are less probable, but they're still likely, and they may still happen based on what we know currently. Possible futures, if you push a little bit further out, they're currently not seen as probable or plausible, but a significant change in circumstances could still result in them happening. And then preposterous futures are improbable, implausible, and currently impossible, and they might be easily dismissed. But even thinking about these can be useful and provoking, and they can provoke truly different thinking in a planning session. So one way to stretch your thinking and thinking of the people you might be working with is to get them to think in these different time frames, moving from projected, probable, plausible, possible, and preposterous outcomes. So sometimes in a design project, I will get people to, I will prompt people to move across these many different time frames to change the way that they are thinking about a design challenge. And for the last few years, I've been interested in an action research method called critical utopian action research, which is a form of action research that has come out of the Scandinavian action research tradition. And so the key terms are critical, utopia, and then action research. And it's a tradition that is asking people to critique the world around them, dream about utopia, and then through action, they start to move to respond to their critique. And when I found this concept in the literature, I thought, well, this is actually design, where people imagine what they want and then they act on it. And so I've been using this as a grounding principle in a lot of the workshops that I've facilitated. So to describe the workshops generally, or maybe in a little bit more detail, because a few seconds ago I gave a vague, broad description. So in a critical utopian action research workshop, participants collaboratively seek to understand their experiences in the context of a wider social structure. And first, the facilitator has to create a space where only critique is allowed. And sometimes for people, this is new, where they have a space where they can be critical and people are actually listening to their opinions about what is wrong. Then a space for social imagination or collective imagination with other people is created, and people imagine their utopian ideal and they respond to the question, where do we want to go? And then finally, in the brainstorming and prototyping and testing phase, they respond to the question about how will we get there? And they can be quite exciting, the workshops. So the core questions in this type of workshop or using this kind of approach is, how do we really want to live? How should we live? Not just survive, but really thrive. And these are the kinds of questions that underlie this type of research framework. So I've been trying to connect these questions with the research that I've been doing. And then over the next few slides, I'll show you some examples of how this could work in real time, in progress. So in Trinidad and Tobago, children at a workshop were invited to critique their school and their village, and then respond to the issues that they uncovered through design. And so they designed different things, like this child designed a type of, almost like a Roomba for the village that would clean the streets of the village because they were identifying litter as a significant problem. In Puerto Rico, students responded to the destruction of Hurricane Maria by critiquing Puerto Rico first in the opening workshop, and then focusing on designing the future that they wanted for Puerto Rico. In the year, we gave them a specific year, myself and my colleague, Dr. Maria de Mater O'Neill, we gave them a specific year of 2054, where they had to imagine the Puerto Rico that they wanted to see in the future. And here you see some of their work in progress, most of the teens actually focused on utopian futures, but actually one person brought in a dystopian future, which was an interesting perspective. And another example here in Oakland, California, youth in a very, very short workshop were encouraged to combine superpowers with technology to solve big problems. And they themselves identified the superpowers that they were interested in. They made the connections between the superpowers and technology, and then they identified the problems that they thought were significant. And then another, my final example, in New Orleans in 2019, in December, we did a workshop where we asked, can we use design in the future to build shared experiences and improve the relationship between the police and the community? And so community residents and the police representatives from the police department spent an entire day working together in a co-design process, getting to understand each other and their different points of views. And then they worked in groups to create strategies to improve their relationships, to develop strategies and programs that they felt would improve their relationship. So I guess a question could be why? Why combine co-creation, equity, and futures? Well, sometimes people can just be too timid about the change that they imagine as possible. You know, they'll say people aren't ready for something, or it's too hard to create change, and they can often list reasons why something is impossible. But pushing people's imagination to the far out future, you know, when we take people to the year 2054 and 2072, or these years that are much further out, this sometimes helps people think beyond the barriers that exist today. Because then we can say, well, by 2054, maybe that barrier should no longer exist. And this also shows people the barriers that, that need to be eliminated today. Because if they can say something like, well, by 2054, this should no longer exist, then we could start figuring out how will we make sure this no longer exists. You know, we can get us to more radical change in the by taking them out of the future, and then we can bring them back to a closer future and then figure out what is a more practical way of getting to that future that we want to. But other people have done this before. You know, other people have imagined radical futures that did not exist. Anti-slavery abolitionists must have been able to imagine a radical future that led to change. And on the screen, there's some artwork by the abolitionist painter William Blake in the late 1700s. And in his artwork, he was imagining a world beyond slavery. And it wasn't the world that we imagine today. You know, so today, maybe if we look at his work, we might still think it's too close to slavery. But in his time, he was really this radical person who was able to take this creative way of representing change in the future. So I guess my closing question, I like to offer many challenges to people throughout a conversation. So the closing question to the designers who are watching this presentation is a variation of the definition of design by Herbert Simon. And the question then is, how might we change existing situations into preferred and more equitable ones where everyone will enjoy full and healthy lives in the future? And I look forward to chatting with you all over the next few minutes. Thank you.
That was so wonderful. Thank you so much, Lesley Ann. We've got some questions coming in, and I've got some additional questions that kind of came up as part of your talk. So, all right, one thing to jump in with, that graphic you showed with the fence and the baseball game, have you seen the adapted version of that image?
I've seen different, oh, I have not seen this one, because actually I found an, oh, yes, I've seen, oh my goodness, I have not seen this one. I saw an earlier version of it before, but I know that every time I talk about that image, people ask about, why don't we just get rid of the fence? Oh, I love that. Can you send me that link?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because as you were saying it, one time I had posted about it. So it just had the reality, the equality, and the equity, and then the justice piece with removing the fence. And I had posted it to my network, and a friend of mine who's also in the social justice space had replied saying, why is the idea of the fence even there? What are the boundaries of the game? Why, you know, who views, who plays, kind of, it brings up all of these questions. And it got me reflecting a lot about this idea that we're, as designers, we kind of are trained to navigate all of those questions. It's almost like a flood of questions that comes up, right? But that's a very specific skill, and not everybody has that kind of just navigating that influx of potential things that might come up, and then it's the overwhelm of, wow, we have to redesign everything. Where do we even start?
Yeah, but that's actually then why I kind of like these future workshops. And so, I mean, I'm not actually in service design, like I said before. I'm in academia, and I can create then very whimsical spaces for people to think imaginatively. So I like to bring in that kind of creative challenge into the design problem to really get people to move beyond the constraints of today, because you sometimes have to do such a mental, maybe mental gymnastics for you to see the kind of big change that is needed. So this is one way that I've found of getting people to really push harder, by just imagining. And sometimes it might mean that everyone is, like I said, it's whimsical spaces that I like to create. Maybe everyone is in costume and there's music in the background and stuff like that, to get people to really push harder and see the things that should not be maintained, because sometimes they're invisible, and so, like, when we always just work around creating incremental change, we are often kind of carrying equity issues forward with us in the work that we're doing. And so we do need radical prompts. Maybe this future thing is one radical prompt, but there are other types of radical prompts that people can use to get them to really see where is the inequity, where are the barriers, who doesn't have access to the things that we're designing. And we have to make sure that we're hearing from people, kind of seeing what are people who are excluded actually saying in these spaces, for us to figure out where the change needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you have two of my new favorite words that came up in this last hour: whimsical and preposterous.
Yeah.
there's something about, as you talk about kind of extremes and outliers and all of these, I think these modes of thought of kind of going beyond how we just normally exist on a day-to-day, like wear a costume, give that permission, kind of give that magic circle, kind of pulling from experience design and the psychology of transformation. Yeah. I love that. Well, kind of, so on that note, one of the questions that came up in the chat is, what is your advice for designers who are working on smaller problems, so that they may not necessarily have that jurisdiction, or they're focused on the near-term future versus that kind of radical change space?
I guess maybe to give really useful advice, I might need some more information, but I mean, off the top of my head, maybe the problem is not as small as you think it is. Maybe that you can see, I think one thing that we don't often have training to see well as designers is maybe the system around a problem or an issue. And so one thing could be to figure out, okay, what's the biggest system that could be holding people back? And maybe you are still intervening in a very small space, but you could also be shining a light, maybe giving other people a heads up on other spaces where an intervention needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of look at there's always change being made. It's relative.
Yes, it is relative. And then we're all parts of the system, but we tend to focus, human-centered design, I guess, encourages us to focus on a smaller part of the system. And every now and again, we have to step back and look at the bigger system and see where maybe in our work we can be highlighting other issues in the system, even as we work on this smaller part of the system.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Another question that came from the audience: how does one analyze political and social change within that futures framework of preposterous, possible, probable? So current political and social change, and the example was labor strikes. So let's say, how might we analyze something like labor strikes in the framework of all those P's?
I'm kind of thinking when they say analyze, what are they? I'm not sure what they are, where they're wanting to go with the analyze, right? But if we are looking at the labor strikes, well, I don't even know. There are a lot of designers, myself included. We're not that great at analysis. We do things. We're action people. And so I would say, if are we going to propose something? Or this is how I would work. Propose something for each of those time frames, and then if I needed to bring it to analysis, maybe I might analyze what part of that of those proposals can we actually take to make some change, and what part, so maybe what can be implemented immediately, what really we don't have the facilities to implement any of this at all, and what do we need to just park on the side and bring back later on? I don't know if that's the kind of analysis that the person is talking about, but after creating the proposals, yes, I would be analyzing the proposals to see what in the proposals can we actually use, so like and sometimes people's proposals just tell you, because I'm working in co-design, sometimes the proposals, as whimsical as they might be, really shine a light on other places that you need to do research. Okay, so like, or either research or action. So if I think about the workshop with the children in Trinidad, the conversations with the children, they uncovered issues that we hadn't been thinking about in the school, because the first activity, they had to critique the school, and all of the children complained about the trees in the school, and that would never have been on anybody's radar, that what could have been the problem with the trees, right? And as they designed their solutions, we were able to understand what was the issue about the trees from the children's perspective, which nobody had ever thought about, right? And the issue about the trees is that the trees actually had wonderful fruit that they could not pick, because the trees were too tall and there were all of these rules. And so, it's almost like you could use then this co-design process as a kind of research method to find the hotspots where you can do something else with it, and like I was recently on a project at Tulane University where we were using co-design as one strategy just to get people to talk about their experience of the pandemic. And so the actual things that they designed weren't really going to be the outcomes. It's that we would then be able to analyze the way they talked, and the conversations that happened while they designed, for us to figure out what else to research. And similarly, the project with the police officers and the residents in New Orleans, we were using the co-design process to build the relationships as they work together. And then we did not, but we could have analyzed all of the things that they designed to figure out what other work we needed to be doing. Okay, so I know we have a few more questions, or one more question.
Sorry, that was mostly for the SDN team. We had a bunch of questions flooding in, so I know we have a few more minutes of checking to see if we can extend the time a little bit to answer at least a couple more. But yes, thank you for that. I think it kind of like it normalizes what I'm hearing you say, is the idea of normalizing that we come out with some questions, maybe some direction and answers, which is very different from expecting just design to yield a bunch of finite answers.
Yes, and you know, it's like I've been thinking over and over, and I'm probably not the only person thinking about this, right? You know, we can use the design process for so many things, other than just creating, in quotes, things, you know, other than just creating solutions. So it's like just going through the design process shines a light on other issues that we can focus on. Even as we create the outcomes, we can analyze the process, and we can analyze other steps of the process to get a new understanding of an issue.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So our next question is, how do you believe service designers can reduce speed, considering that designers live in a system that forces us to be agile?
Yeah, we even have methods called agile, right? I don't know. It's almost like we have to have it. Now, don't sue me for saying this, but it's almost like we need a mass revolt or something like that, where it really needs to come from us, where we are telling people, the people that we work with, the people that we work for, that things have to slow down. Particularly at this time, at this point in the pandemic, people are exhausted. If you are doing co-design with people, you can't go at the same speed that you might have been able to go at 2 years ago. So, even if the people above you don't recognize this, maybe you have to find ways of, whether it's gently, whether it's a little bit more forcefully, just reinforcing over and over that the process has to slow down. Build that time, that extra time into the activities that you're doing. Build the extra time into the projects as you're planning them. Kellyanne McCurcher, who I showed an image of her book cover and did not call their name, has a book called Beyond the Sticky Notes. And in that, there's a quote that always sticks with me from that book that says the relationship has to be built over cups of tea. Right. So, you have to build that time into the process, and then there's this other thing, that the relationship goes at the speed of trust, which I believe is also from that book, and so, we can try to do projects in shorter time, but if people don't trust us, actually the projects can't happen. They can't be done well. So it's just something that we're going to have to reinforce over and over, that things have to slow down so that we can build trust. I guess one other thing that I could say to the person is that, yes, we also have to figure out what are the trust building strategies that we can use, whether it is, I refer to a few of them, like maybe it is something about storytelling or food, or creating community with people. We have to find also ways of accelerating the trust building process if the time really cannot be extended.
Mm-hmm. I love that you said that. I feel like that covers a handful of the questions. It's kind of that answer is kind of aligned. Like, how do you get sponsorship from people who are resistant, change resistant? How do you help people see the value of play? Kind of all of those. So excellent. We're cranking through the questions. I will. We can go through two more.
Okay.
Do you know of any examples that you can share of service design frameworks that are more connected with countries in the global South or non-English speaking countries?
I know designers in the global South who I am connected to a service design network in Brazil, I believe, but I don't actually know the frameworks that they're using. I do know it's a different kind, or let me not say I know, I feel it is a different pace that they work out at, and that they are using different strategies. So one framework, I don't have to call it a framework, but one reference that I've heard a lot of my friends in Brazil using is theater of the oppressed. I talked about pedagogy of the oppressed, but there is also theater of the oppressed, which by Augusto Boal, I believe. I don't know enough about how to use this, but I know it is a very relational process that a few of my friends in service design seem to be using. I will call the name of a colleague of mine in Brazil. I did undergrad in Brazil, so I do know a lot of Brazilian designers, but Fred Van Amstel right now is one of my colleagues who I'm just kind of always saying, what is Fred saying? I'll put his name in your chat if you want to share it in the other chat. And then I know that there's a service design, no, it's a sustainability design conference in Curitiba later on this year. But they are working differently. Fred's work is very influenced by people who are activists. You know, it's in Brazil and in Latin America. I think in general, I think that there would be a different focus, you know, where the work is inspired by activism and more popular movements. So there are people to follow, and Fred is the only one I can think of right now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I see. I was trying to paste what you had in the chat.
Yes, I can say another name. Rodrigo Gonzato is another person to follow. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Wonderful. Okay. So you had talked about the idea of the quote about utopia. Because we'll never have everyone agreeing on any particular utopia, does that mean we must naturally exclude people?
Yes. You wouldn't expect me to say yes, but the reality is yes. And it's not quite that we're going to exclude people, but so the way I work, and I work with a couple of corporations that think the same way, is that we have to figure out which utopia are we most interested in. And so the utopia that we are interested in when we do this equity focused work is the utopia of people who are always excluded. And so we're moving them to the center. And so maybe there are people who are normally centered in the conversation, and their utopia is not the one that we are designing for. We are designing for people who are normally marginalized, people who are, you know, people who have no access to services because they're on wheelchairs, you know, people who have their gender identity excludes them from basic services, people of color, you know, so it's really those people whose utopia I'm interested in and that I encourage people to think about, you know, and who are the people who are normally excluded and how can we build a utopia that works for them.
I love that. What a perfect way to end. Well, thank you so very much for sharing your insights and your knowledge with us. Thank you everyone for the questions. This has been a wonderful dialogue.